So good afternoon. So let's start the first session. Viewpoint from the Americas. The first speaker is the Martin Shikora. The title of the talk is the early peopling of North Eurasia and the Americas, an ancient genomics perspective. Please, Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for the invitations. It's a really wonderful opportunity to present here in Japan. The topic for me today is to give you some kind of a broad introduction into what we have learned about the early peopling of North Eurasia and the Americas from ancient genomics. So that's my specialty. I'm a population genomicist, and I think everyone is aware that in the last couple of years we've made tremendous progress in the sequencing of ancient DNA, which has led to some very, very important discoveries about past population movements. So I try to give you a sort of semi-detailed overview and summary of what we have learned in those last couple of years from that. To start off, we'll start at the beginning as usual with the out-of-Africa model of human dispersals. I think we're all very much aware of this model, but I think it sets a nice stage for what we're going to be talking about later on. So in the out-of-Africa model of modern human dispersals, we have some, the location of which we don't really have a very good idea at the moment still, but we have origin of anatomically modern humans in Africa, probably many, many different groups. And then at some point, 50, 60, maybe 70,000 years ago, we had this sort of initial dispersal out of Africa, which was followed by a quite rapid dispersal all across the planet, essentially. And by 10,000 years ago, humans were all the way down in South America. So really quite an amazing, remarkable journey that our species has been on. So some of the features of this model that we're going to go back to here in my talk is we, have inferred there's definitely evidence for some sort of early divergence between Western and Eastern Eurasians. You can maybe don't pay too much attention to the locations of that, but just that this is something that we see from the data. And then, of course, in the topic of this symposium, we also have somewhere over here in Asia the origin of the first Native Americans diverging from an early East Eurasian branch of our human family tree. And this is sort of let's say the state of the art about 10 years ago before we had ancient humans. So that's what we would have then considered to be the sort of baseline model of modern human dispersals. You can see this in the genetic data. So this is the data from a 2016 paper on modern human genetic diversity. And you don't have to care too much about the actual labels here, just to say that this is a tree of genetic relatedness between modern human populations based on whole genome sequences, based on the full genomic variation. And the main features here that are consistent with this out-of-Africa model is we have African populations here representing sort of the earliest branching diverse groups. And then we have sort of a broad separation between Western Eurasian populations on one hand side and Eastern Eurasians and Americas on the other side. The problem with this model, or the sort of limitations of doing these kinds of inferences in genetics from modern DNA, is that they only tell us something about populations that were present, that survived to present day. Right? We can make a lot of inferences about the relationship of those people, but we don't really have any way to go further back into the past, or we didn't have one until a couple of years ago, to ask, well, what did people look like? What were the ancestries like? What was genetic diversity like 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago? And the amazing thing of ancient DNA and ancient genomics is that now we have the ability to do that, not just in humans, but in many other species. But the human ancient DNA revolution is, of course, on the forefront of this. So this is just a distribution from a summary of last year of the number of ancient human genomes that have been published and their locations and ages over the past 10 years. And you can see from a quite slow start from 2010 to 2014 with only 43, we're now in a situation where every year we get thousands and thousands of new ancient genomes. So it's an extremely fast-moving field, very, very data-driven. So it's sometimes even hard for us as geneticists to keep up with sort of the latest developments there. But we've also learned an awful lot from this data. And what I would like to focus on today is essentially structured in three parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the genetic landscape of the sort of pre-last glacial maximum populations of northern Eurasia. Then we'll move forward to the populations after the last glacial maximum, so the patterns of admixture and continuity among those different populations. And then I would like to close with a bit of a summary of what we know from the genetic data. Again, the focus is on the genetics, but also some of the open questions, and a lot of this will echo also some of the remarks that Professor Potter has made before in his introductory lecture. Okay. So what do we know about pre-LGM populations? Now here I have made a map of distribution of archaeological remains from which we and others have successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA to analyze that predate the last glacial maximum. So you see, if we focus on the East Eurasian side, there's not actually all that many, even though it is quite remarkable that we can do it, but it is only 6 individuals starting from around 45,000 years ago, with Ustishim as the oldest individual, all the way down to Malta here from Lake Baikal, which is 26,000 years ago. That we do have genomic data from those individuals that we can use to analyze. And then I have included here some of the earliest individuals from Western Eurasia, so the sites that I've been working on also in Sungir and Kostenki, because they form sort of a nice anchor of what we can see in terms of diversity of these early people. So the first question that we always want to ask when we get a new genome from some of these people is like, well, how do they actually relate to present-day populations? As I said, we have a pretty good idea of the sort of broad picture of the out of Africa and human dispersals, but from the modern data alone, we will not be able to predict how individuals at Sungir or Tianyang cave here in China would have genetically been related to these present-day populations. So one way to do that is we have a statistical toolkit that allows us to do that. So this is just one way of representing these relationships. So we basically take an ancient genome here, the individual from Sungir, and we just ask how similar it is genetically to any kind of present-day population. So these are marked here with these dots in different colors. And this is a plot that resembles a type of a heat map. So the brighter the color, the hotter the color, if you want, the more similar this individual is to those populations. So what you can see from this result here from Sungir, from this West Eurasian Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer group, is that they are actually somewhat closer related already to present-day Western Eurasian populations. So there's a bit of a gradient here, bright, in Western Eurasia, and then not so much in Eastern Eurasia. If we look at the 40,000-year-old individual here from Tianyang cave, that was first published genomic data by Yang et al. In 2017, the picture is quite different. So you see that now we see a lot of affinity with present-day populations from Eastern Asia. And what that tells us is that even though these individuals lived 40,000 years, up to 40,000 years before the present, they already in some way resemble the deep east-west structure we observe today as a consequence of these early dispersals. So we already have some amount of east-west structure between Western Eurasia and East Asia already established by 40,000 years ago. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to see this kind of differentiation between those two individuals. So in a sense, genetic structure today across Eurasia is still quite old. It basically predates back almost to the out of Africa. Oops. Yeah. Now we've heard already today in the introductions about this quite remarkable site up here called Yana. So that's the only pre-LGM remains from the high Arctic up here. It's the oldest human presence in the high Arctic. And I was lucky enough to be very much involved in a study of the genomes of these individuals. So the human remains from this site were 2 milk teeth from children that we sequenced 2 of them to quite high coverage and a good quality genome. And so obviously we wanted to know the same things, like how do these people relate to what we then already knew about other Upper Paleolithic early Eurasian populations. So we do the same kind of analysis, and we can see here now all of a sudden it looks different again. So instead of having affinity to either West Eurasia or East Eurasia, we actually see this kind of very broad affinity here all across Northern Eurasia. So they're mostly similar both to West Eurasian populations in the north, but also to East Eurasian populations. So a different pattern to that we see both for Sungir or for Tianyang cave. And also, as you can see here, already quite strong affinities with Native Americans. because we got really good quality data, we could use that now actually to do some more in-depth demographic modeling, so to actually put some times and some numbers on these processes. And for that, I'm gonna, for the rest of the talk, build up sort of a model we used, we did in the analysis of IANA to relate all these different East and West and Native American groups to each other. So we start off here as a sort of a baseline with this deep divergence between Europe and East Asia, so West and East. We date that around 43,000 years ago with our approach, and it's not using these ancient genomes because they're not a good enough quality for doing this analysis, but I've put them here to kind of mark the points of where they would fall, right? So Songdi would be an early descendant from somewhere here, and Tianyang Cave would be some early group up here. When we put IANA into this model, what we find was actually quite interesting and also relates to this different affinity to modern day populations in that it didn't fit neither on the western side completely nor on the eastern side completely. We actually best modeled it as a mixture between a West Eurasian lineage that diverged about 39,000 years ago from the other West Eurasian populations, but then also receives about a third of its ancestry from an eastern group. So from, again, this is using present-day East Asians as a proxy here, but it was likely some eastern population, maybe related to the Tianyang Cave individual. So this confirms this kind of pattern we see from the sharing with modern-day populations, that IANA is actually in a lineage that's sort of intermediate between East and West. And the interesting thing is here that it is quite high in the Arctic here, very far to the northeast, but genetically it actually resembles more closely the populations much further in the west than the populations down here in the southeast. Now, how do the other upper Paleolithic genomes fall in this kind of scenario? We didn't model them per se because, again, the quality of the data was not good enough to do this kind of modeling, but I will just indicate here where we know that they would be without having particular times of divergence. So a very important sample, of course, here from Malta, which essentially is a sister group of IANA, so it's closely related to it. It also derives from this early East-West mix and is ancestrally related to the ancient North Siberians represented by IANA. In 2020, Masigliano et al. Published a genome from a 34,000-year-old individual here from Mongolia. It's called Salkit, so it's extracted from this part of the skull. And here we see a similar intermediate position. So we again have an East-West mix, but in this case, it is more shifted towards the East Eurasian side. So Salkit is a bit more closely related to the earlier groups here in the East than it is to the West. And in their publication, they model it as a kind of a mix of an early Tianyuan-related lineage and something that derives from IANA. Back last year, was a very interesting paper by Mao et al. Here from Zhang Meifu's group in China, and they managed to get some more data from another early individual here from East Asia, this time a little bit further northeast, so from the Amur River Basin, so it's 33,000 years old. And this individual was shown to be actually quite similar to the Tianyang Cave individual. So we have what looks like sort of a broader population here in Northeast Asia that that was, at least from 40 to 33,000 years ago, quite genetically similar, with no evidence of any gene flow from the West. And then finally, Ustishim is something that we also want to briefly mention. That's the oldest human remains still sequenced from Siberia, so it's 40,000 years ago. And that one actually was shown to be at the base of all this. So it's neither related to the Eastern nor Western Eurasian individual. So that represents one of those cases of an individual that represents a strand of ancestry that just didn't leave any descendants that we know of later on. So we don't really have any later populations that are closely related to Ustishim. Okay, so this was the picture before the last glacial maximum, and as we all know, the last glacial maximum was a quite harsh environment. So that is also not very conducive to find interesting human remains to study and to sequence. So we have quite a bit of a gap here in terms of the timeline of where we actually have individuals that we can say something about. So I mean, Malta technically, I guess you can call, falls within the last glacial maximum. But in the last 2 to 3 years, a number of new data have appeared on the genetics, which I think are quite exciting and just start to make the picture a little bit clearer of what the people that were living around this area after the last glacial maximum would have looked like. So we have now, again, from last year, an individual from 19,000 years ago, from Mao et al., from the Amur River Basin with some good genomic data. There's the sample from Afontovagora from 18,000 years ago. Also last year, a new genome was published from this Kayergas cave here from the Lena River that is about 18,000 years old. And then we have this Uskiatka sample here, also called UKY in the previous introductions here from Lake Baikal at 14,000. And then some of the later groups like Paleosiberians and early Native Americans that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to start with using the USR1 sample from Apotsan River and we used this individual in our study to model Native American ancestry and origins of Native Americans in the publication on Yana. So I will use this as a proxy for the first America's genomic diversity that we know of. Before doing that, I just want to go back to Malta for a second, because Malta was really one of those amazing examples of a single genome. It was already published in 2014, so quite early in the ancient DNA timeline. It's a single genome, but that, you know, with this single genome, a lot of that completely changed our perception or knowledge of human population history in the region. So as a reminder, we have shown later on that Malta is a kind of a sister lineage here to these ancient North Siberians up here in Yana. It was sampled 24,000 years ago near Lake Baikal. And when my colleagues in Copenhagen started to look at this genome in 2014, they found this extremely puzzling distribution of genetic similarities. So again, here we have this type of heat map where we can see similarity of this individual to present-day populations from around the world. And what you can notice here is that first on, we have this same pattern of high similarity with northern Eurasians that Yana have, so sort of a broad line here of all highly related samples to populations to Malta. But what was more striking was that the most similarity, the most genetic affinity to Malta was actually found in the Americas, which was really surprising at that time, because that was certainly not expected from a genetic point of view from an individual here from the East Asian side. Or that's not up here in Beringia also, but from somewhere here near Lake Baikal. Now we know that this was essentially the first time we observed a pattern that is now very well established as the dual ancestry of ancestral Native Americans. So we know now, with many subsequent studies, that all Native Americans descending from the first ancestral Native Americans migrating here through Beringia are derived from this mixture event of a lineage that is related to East Asians deeply. So, you know, we estimated in our paper about 30,000 years ago a split of this particular lineage here from the other East Asian populations. And then sometime around 20,000 years ago received some gene flow from a population related to these ancient North Siberians. And, you know, here we estimated about 18%. It depends a little bit on which method you use, but it is on the order of 20 to 40% of the ancestry of Native Americans that derives from this West Eurasian lineage related to ancient North Siberia. So this is the results here for the American side of the Beringian Strait. Up until 3 years ago, we didn't really have any information on what the genetic diversity would have looked like on the Asian side. But then, as part of our study, we found so we managed to get good genomic data from this individual here from Kolyma River at about 10,000 years ago, which is you know, it is quite a bit younger, but it nevertheless is sort of the oldest sample we still have from that particular region. And the obvious question for us was, well, how does that relate to all these other groups here, and in particular also to these first Americans? Is it just a direct ancestor of those? Is it somehow differently related? So we do the same kind of analysis again, and we can see that we find very broad affinities to present-day populations here from the Northeast, also to the Americas, but in particular, so the most closely related populations to this Kolyma River individual were these groups here from Kamchatka, so the Koyak and Itelmen, so Paleo-Siberian language-speaking groups, they're suggesting at least some amount of continuity in the region. So there's certainly a higher amount of Kolyma River-related ancestry in these groups than in some of the other ones. So there's a certain amount of continuity since the time of Kolyma River. When we put Kolyma River on our demographic model, we can see that it is very closely related to the ancestral Native Americans. So our best fit model here, we found a divergence time of the East Eurasian ancestral lineages of Native Americans in Kolyma from around 24,000 years ago. And then in our modeling, the best fit model was one where we have them two independent mixture events into these already split lineages coming from ancient North Siberians around the same time, maybe a little bit more recent for Beringians than for Kolyma, and slightly different in terms of the amount of admixture from these ancient North Siberians. So it's generally a little bit higher, the amount for the ancient Beringians and ancestral Native Americans than it is for Kolyma River, which we used in our publication and to term this new population that was present up here, ancient Paleo-Siberians. And Professor Honda has also already mentioned that already in his introduction. Things got a little bit more interesting now in the last 2 years because a couple more genomes have been published that sort of complicate this picture a little bit but also allow for some exciting new analysis, I think, to be coming in the near future. So just last year, a paper came out from Kilins et al., from our colleagues in University of Stockholm, who sequenced genomic data from an individual here, Kargas1, that is about 7,000 years old. And we haven't really modeled it yet very well onto this backbone, but we can say that it certainly also represents the same type of mixture of ancient North Siberians and ancient East Asians as the ancient Paleo-Siberians do. Again, 2 years ago, this Uskiatka or UKY individual was published down here from Lake Baikal, and it's also in some way related to these ancient Paleo-Siberians. So we basically have this group of individuals here that all are very similar in terms of their genetic makeup in relation to ancient North Siberians and to East Asians, with slight differences in proportions and relatedness among themselves, but definitely pointing to sort of a broad zone here where we would find these ancient populations that all are sort of intermediate between ancient North Siberians and East Asians. Last year, there was also another genome from the Mao et al. Study that was from the post-LGM, the earliest sample here from the Amur River Basin. So that's 19,000 years ago. And as the previous population here, this did not show any evidence for admixture with ancient North Siberians or other sources in West Eurasian. But on the other hand side, it did form sort of the closest East Asian ancestor we know to the origins of Native Americans and Paleo-Siberians prior to the admixture with ancient North Siberians. An interesting question, of course, is how do the native people of Japan, the Jomon, fit into this picture? And Professor Ota will talk a lot about that tomorrow, but I was just going to mention here that we found already in a previous study that they're actually quite different and not really related to the events that are going here. So this appears to be like a sort of an earlier divergence from the early East Eurasian lineage. And there is now very good data on that. So there's many genomes now from Jomon-related people. So this seems to be a quite consistent pattern. And then finally, we have this individual here from Afontovagora 3, which also is, again, doesn't show any evidence for admixture with East Asians, but it is just a continuation genetically from the 24,000-year-old individual in Malta. So there, again, seems to be some amount of continuity through the LGM here in the Lake Baikal region. All right. So the last couple of minutes, I just want to use to revise and go back to the patterns that I've just described and what we've seen here, and in particular also highlight some of the limitations of our models and what we can do and what we cannot do from genetic data, and where I think there's a lot of possibility for some interesting new analysis and modeling together with other types of data that are not genetic in order to further distinguish all these different scenarios that Dr. Potter here has outlined already in his introduction. So one of the first interesting question is, particular to me, because I'm very interested in these pre-LGM populations, is this kind of structure that we already see in the the pre-LGM populations early on. So we have a number of individuals here now that we can see from the genetics are in this intermediate position between East and West already quite early on. So there's this Yana as a mixture between Sungir and Tianyuan cave and Salkit with a bit more Eastern ancestry. So when we look at the distribution of these samples, I mean, they're quite broadly distributed here across northeastern Eurasia. So questions that we would like to know, which we can't really answer at the moment with the genetic data, is where and when did this actually occur? I mean, we have a pretty good idea about when, but not so much about where, you know, whether this was something that some sort of a contact zone here all across where different groups from down here and from up here met, or whether there was already some sort of admixture over here and then everyone migrated here. These are questions that we don't really have a good handle on from the genetic data. We have very poor ways of locating events in space. We are very good at locating them in time and capturing similarities and differences between populations, but then mapping that onto space is something that is a little bit more complicated still. And I just want to highlight there are some very recent results that I think are very exciting in this regard and just show the complications of this. And this is a study from last year from Matea Hacinak and co-workers, where they sequenced DNA of genomes of the initial Upper Paleolithic of Western Eurasia here from Pachukiro cave in Bulgaria. And hopefully by now you'll be familiar with these types of plots. Again, we're showing here the relationship of Pachukiro to different groups around the world with warmer colors indicating higher amount of shared ancestry. And as you can see, unexpectedly, I think very surprisingly, this individual is actually genetically more similar to East Asian population than it is to present-day West Eurasian populations. As you recall, we were looking at later individuals from Sungir and Kostenki over here that certainly had more affinity to Western Eurasian. So this definitely points towards some complex replacements happening even in Western Europe quite early on at 45,000 years ago. And then to come back to the question of where that East-West admixture happened, well, we have an individual here present already at 45,000 years ago that actually seems to also be in some way related more to Eastern Eurasians, which opens up a really huge amount of space of where and how often these kind of contacts could have happened. So I think there's a lot of unknowns in this particular part. A very important question, obviously, is for us is where was this dual ancestry of ancestral Native Americans actually formed? So we know that there is this mixture between ancient North Siberians and ancient Northeast Asians. At the moment, we have the sort of best genetic proxies for those admixing source populations in Afon Tuvagora here for ancient North Siberians and here in the Amur River Basin for the East Asians. So, you know, this is kind of the locations of the best proxies, but we still don't know, does that mean that Lake Baikal area would be a good place for that, as many people have proposed? We don't really know that, again, from looking at the genetics themselves. What is interesting, though, is when we look at the fine-scale relationships between these ancient Paleo-Siberians and the ancestral Native Americans, we do again see this very, very broad range all the way from Lake Baikal up to Kolyma River of individuals that are in some way a similar type of mixture of ancient North Siberians and ancient Northeast Asians with slight differences. So I just wanted to highlight here that if you actually just look at the proportions of the two ancestral strains in these three different groups, the oldest individual here from Lena River, from Kaigas, is actually the one that is most similar to the mixture proportions of ancient Native Americans. So it's roughly the same amount of ancient North Siberian and East Asian, whereas both Kolyma and in particular UKI1 have actually more affinity to East Asian, so they have slightly higher amounts of ancestry from this region. And again, you might, be able to start to form some geographic arguments here. Maybe that would point towards a location more here, but I'm just putting this out there as hopefully as discussion points and discussion starters. We don't really know from the genetics. This is just our observations, and we will have to do some more work on that. And then, of course, something we hopefully will also hear more tomorrow. How would the early peoples here of the Japanese archipelago, so the ones before Jomon, relate to Jomon and to Native Americans? Unfortunately, as of today, we don't have any genetic data. There's also new, as far as I have learned, there's no human remains available. So in that sense, it will be at the current stage difficult to address that with genetic means, but hopefully in the not so distant future, we'll be able in some way to maybe get a glimpse of that through genetics as well. And with that, I would like to close. It seems like I managed to keep time. Of course, this is the work of a lot of people and not just myself. So I would like to thank the most important collaborators there and definitely also a lot of the funding that is necessary to do this kind of work. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shikara. We have 20 seconds. If you have very short, brief question, if you have. Well, actually, we have the round table tomorrow afternoon, so we should move on. So next speaker is Dr. John Hawker. The title is Human Settlement of Northern Eurasia and Beringia, Anatomy, Diet, and Technology. Please, Dr. Hawker.
Thank you. The settlement of northern Eurasia by anatomically modern humans and their predecessors provides an essential context for understanding the peopling of Beringia and the Western Hemisphere. Although the Neanderthals and Denisovans adapted to some cold and relatively unproductive North Eurasian environments, only modern humans occupied the Arctic and Beringia. A string of new archaeological discoveries during the past 2 decades reveals that they successfully occupied most habitats and climate zones above latitude 40 degrees north before and during the last glacial maximum. And it appears increasingly unlikely that Beringian environments represented an ecological barrier to the Western Hemisphere for Homo sapiens. The Neanderthals inhabited Western Europe during glacial periods as well as interglacials, where climates are mild and plant and animal productivity are relatively high. But their spatial temporal distribution in Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, where climates are more continental and biological productivity lower, was limited. The Denisovans are found only in Asia. Both taxa were present in the Altai Mountains of southwest Siberia during the earlier late Pleistocene. They appear to have been largely, if not wholly, confined to places where natural shelters and wood were available. Little is known about Denisovan anatomy or diet, but the Neanderthals are represented by a large sample of skeletal remains, which exhibit various anatomical adaptations to low temperature, including thick chest, large head, and shortened extremities. It may be assumed that their caloric demands were high, based on their body mass and climate setting. Stable isotope analyses and zooarchaeology indicate a high animal protein and fat diet with an emphasis on large mammals. The technology of the Neanderthals, and probably the Denisovans, included composite weapons and tools comprising 3 or 4 components: a wooden shaft or handle, a stone point or retouch blank, and an adhesive, such as resin or bitumen, and or a lashing line, to attach the stone blank to the wooden shaft or handle. Prepared core techniques were employed to produce stone blanks of desired size and shape. In other words, they were part of the production process. These composite artifacts are reconstructed based on traces of hafting wear and the adhesives on the stone blanks. Neanderthal technology also included at least several types of single component wooden weapons and tools, such as a thrusting spear and digging stick, as well as single component stone implements, such as bifaces apparently held in the hand. The Neanderthals made extensive use of controlled fire, but there is some indirect evidence that they lacked fire-making technology, such as a fire drill. Compelling evidence for artificial structures is absent. Given their presence in Southwest Europe during periods of extreme cold, low biological productivity may have been a more severe limiting factor than winter temperature. Despite their anatomical and dietary adaptations to northern environments, Neanderthal genetics reveal small populations with high inbreeding coefficients, subject to periodic local extinction. In the Altai region, a 2020 whole genome analysis from Chigirskaya Cave indicates an inbred population of less than 60 individuals. Derived from lower latitudes, modern humans dispersed in northern Eurasia during a warm interval that began about 47,000 calendar years ago, following Heinrich Event 5, Cold Heinrich Event 5. The recent identification of modern human remains in Layer 11 of Bachokiro in Bulgaria, based on the analysis of ancient DNA, confirms their association with the initial Upper Paleolithic, or the IUP. Accordingly, dated IUP artifact assemblages containing diagnostic Levallois blades and points may be used to track the spread of modern humans out of the Levant and into Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Western and Southern Siberia, Mongolia, and Northern China. In Siberia, modern human remains are identified at Ustishim, and IUP artifacts are found in Denisova Cave, both dating to about 45,000 years ago. In addition to the IUP sites, many localities in the more continental areas of Eastern Europe yield artifacts which, although technically classified as Middle Paleolithic, contain similar assemblages with Levallois blades and points that date to less than 50,000 years. I suspect that these sites also are archaeological proxies for modern humans, but this has yet to be confirmed with diagnostic skeletal remains or ancient DNA. The IUP, and perhaps the sites with similar artifacts in Eastern Europe, appear to represent the initial spread of modern humans across northern Eurasia, the so-called meta-population that precedes the emergence of regional populations and local early Upper Paleolithic industries. The meta-population comprises the basal Eurasian lineages, with close ties to their source population in Africa, and exhibits significant genetic admixture with the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Dates on both the earliest IUP sites and modern human remains in Europe and northern Asia indicate rapid dispersal in less than 2 millennia, possibly facilitated by abandonment of colder and drier regions such as the Central East European plain during Cold Heinrich Event 5 by the local Neanderthal or Denisovan population. The lowest occupation level at Kostjanki 1, dated to roughly 45,000 years ago, exhibits a pattern similar to that found in North American sites that represent the initial spread of first peoples after 15,000 years ago. The dismembered remains of a single subadult mammoth, associated with a few artifacts and an active spring. By 40,000 years ago, regional populations and local Upper Paleolithic industries may be identified in northern Eurasia. In East Asia, the former are represented by the adult male skeleton from Tenyuan Cave in North China. Whole genome analysis of these remains shows that he is ancestral to living East and Southeast Asians. Despite the genomic contribution from the local Neanderthal population, modern humans in northern Eurasia seem to have acquired few, if any, of the evolved anatomical adaptations to cold climate of the former. While only fragmentary skeletal remains have been recovered from time periods before 40,000 years ago, complete skeletons from later periods before the last glacial maximum indicate retention of anatomy better suited to warm climate zones. The brachial index for the Tenyuan cave male is comparable to that of living peoples in the temperate zone. But for Kostjanki 14 in Sungir, on the Central East European plain, the brachial index is comparable to that of people in the tropical zone, which would have rendered them susceptible to hypothermia and cold injury. Stable isotope analyses in zooarchaeology reveal a northern diet comparable to that of the Neanderthals, showing significant niche overlap, but also a dietary breadth expanded to smaller vertebrates, while their genetics reflect adaptation to a diet high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. The technology of modern humans in northern Eurasia before 30,000 years ago included mechanical weapons and untended facilities, as well as cold weather technology, such as insulated clothing, artificial shelters, and probably fire-making technology. New research indicates that most of these technologies were present during the period of initial settlement above latitude 40 degrees north before 40,000 years ago. Mechanical projectile weaponry is inferred from the morphometrics of Levallois points in the IUP and indicated by diagnostic impact fractures in southwest Europe roughly 45,000 years ago. Evidence for snaring and or trapping small mammals is reported from the Central East European plain before 40,000 years ago, based on a concentration of hair remains comprising all skeletal parts, and some supporting stable isotope data from human remains in a younger context in Crimea. The design of the snares and/or traps is unknown, but the functional requirements of these devices indicate that they contained one or more mechanical components. Evidence for sewn clothing in the form of eye needles is dated to about 45,000 years ago in the IUP level at Denisova Cave in southwest Siberia. Although the details of the clothing design are unknown for this early period, human figurines from Buret in southern Siberia, dating to the last glacial maximum, show a complete winter suit, including a tight-fitting hood, possibly operated with a mechanical drawstring. Comparison with recent hunter-gatherers at high latitudes suggests that Upper Paleolithic winter clothing probably comprised more than 100 components. Traces of mechanical rotary drills, which suggest fire-making technology, are found in both Eastern Europe and Southwest Siberia, dating to before 40,000 years ago. But reliable traces of an artificial shelter are younger, dated to about 32,000 years ago at the open-air site of Mira in south-central Ukraine, located on the wide floodplain of the Dnieper River. Paleodemographic information are not yet available for the period before 40,000 years ago, but population size estimates have been generated for the period between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, both on the Central East European plain and in the Siberian Arctic, indicating relatively large hunter-gatherer populations with little inbreeding. Modern humans were an invasive species in northern Eurasia, hampered by an anatomical pattern better suited to the lower latitudes. They nevertheless drove the local Neanderthal and Denisova populations to extinction within a few thousand years and occupied habitats and climate zones beyond the range of their predecessors. The explanation for this phenomenon lies in the fact that modern humans, including the basal Eurasian lineages, were equipped with most of the technologies found among recent hunter-gatherers of the Arctic and subarctic. By contrast, the Neanderthals and Denisovans apparently possessed few of the food-getting technologies and none of the clothing and shelter technologies of recent hunter-gatherers in high latitudes. In my view, it is important to understand how significant and even fundamental the contrast is between the technology of modern humans and that of their Neanderthal Denisovan predecessors. It is critical to understanding not only how and why modern humans quickly adapted to virtually every habitat and climate zone above latitude 40 degrees north, including Arctic Beringia, but also how and why they developed sedentary settlements, wide-scale agriculture, and urban centers when plant and animal productivity rose at the end of the Pleistocene. By any measure, the technologies of modern humans in northern Eurasia before 30,000 years ago were more complex than those of the Neanderthals and Denisovans. By most measures of complexity, the technologies of modern humans exhibit an exponential increase over those of their predecessors. With respect to numbers of discrete components, a comparison of the most complex known artifacts of the Neanderthals, composite tools and weapons, comprising 3 or 4 parts, with those of modern humans before 30,000 years ago, insulated winter clothing, which probably required production and assembly of more than 100 components, shows an exponential increase. The numbers of production steps are tied to the numbers of components and exhibit a similar pattern. And in terms of numbers of organizational levels or structural complexity, which may be applied to both the hierarchical organization of discrete components and to the production steps, the complexity of modern human technology again shows an exponential increase. I suggest that the most revealing measure of the increased complexity of modern human technologies is the complexity of the process of artifact design. The increased complexity of artifact design by modern humans in northern Eurasia before 30,000 years ago may be described as a quantum jump, in other words, as a greater than exponential increase. In order to understand the process of artifact design, we turn to design theory, which is a relatively new area of modern engineering science. A theory of design was proposed in the 1960s by Herbert Simon and developed in practice during the 70s and 80s as software programs were written to facilitate the process. To measure the complexity of the design process, we turn to formal design theory, which provides a mathematical foundation for the latter. As described in modern engineering textbooks, the process of design takes place within the context of a specific problem and is creative and without a predetermined result. Open-ended, with multiple possible satisfactory solutions. Trial and error, with many dead ends as alternatives are considered and rejected. With all but the simplest artifacts, the number of possible alternative designs for each parameter is very large and must be kept to a manageable level with the use of existing components and production methods. Anecdotal evidence provides insight to the scope of alternative designs. Thomas Edison's lab reportedly tested 6,000 different materials for the filament during the process of designing the light bulb. In modern engineering, new designs are largely, if not wholly, the product of recombination of previously designed parts and production methods. In formal design theory, the artifact is treated as an algebraic structure, and the process of designing an artifact is treated as a form of computation. And while the production of an artifact from an existing design represents a deterministic computation or algorithm, the creative process of designing an artifact clearly represents a non-deterministic or evolutionary computation, also known as an evolutionary algorithm. Evolutionary computation entails a heuristic search through a potentially very large search space to find the solution space, which, in an engineering context, may contain many satisfactory solutions to the problem. By placing the artifact design process within an evolutionary computation frame of reference, formal design theory allows us to apply measures of computational complexity to artifact design that have been developed within computation theory. The most commonly used measure is the number of steps required to perform the computation, or time complexity, which refers to the amount of computer time required to yield a solution. For a non-deterministic or evolutionary computation, the time complexity may be enormous because of the potentially large number of alternative possibilities that may be considered. A classic example from computation theory is the traveling salesperson problem, or TSP, solved by figuring out the shortest possible tour among a set of cities to be visited. There is no efficient algorithm for the TSP, which requires laborious calculation and comparison of the many alternative combinations of distances, an exponential function of the number of cities. For example, a set of 10 cities yields more than 3.6 million alternatives. In 1998, a team of mathematicians solved the TSP for a set of 13,509 cities by applying a novel algorithm with 32 interconnected personal computers, although the computation required 3.5 months. Another commonly used measure of computational complexity is the amount of memory storage space required to perform the computation, referred to as space complexity. There is a relationship between space and time complexity that is important for evolutionary computation in both mathematics and engineering. The greater the available space for memory storage, the fewer the number of steps required to yield a solution. It is a basic principle of computation theory. The power of a Turing machine to compute all computable numbers is based on its theoretically infinite memory tape. In an engineering context, stored memory corresponds to the existing knowledge base of the materials, components, and production techniques. Braha and Maimon have shown that for all but the simplest artifacts, the design process is intractable without a substantial knowledge base. There are simply too many alternatives to evaluate for each parameter, as illustrated by the thousands of alternative materials tested by Edison's design team for the filament, a single parameter of a light bulb. And as with the TSP, as the number of variables or parameters increases, the number of potential alternatives increases exponentially. As the number of materials, components, and production techniques required to yield a satisfactory artifact solution to the problem increase, the number of possible alternative designs becomes immense in the absence of a robust engineering knowledge base. This explains why new designs are largely, if not wholly, the product of recombination of previously designed parts and production methods. The application of formal design theory to the technology of modern humans and their predecessors in northern Eurasia is predicated on the assumption that the process of artifact design among hunter-gatherers and modern industrial societies is fundamentally similar. Clearly, there are major differences between the two with respect to materials and production techniques, and most importantly, there are significant differences with respect to the storage of information and computational aids outside the brain in the form of written language and mathematics, and now computers with engineering design software. But I assume that the creative, open-ended, and trial and error process of artifact design was fundamentally the same among hunter-gatherers of both the recent and ancient past. The ethnographic, ethnohistoric record of recent foraging peoples provides valuable insights to artifact design in hunter-gatherer societies. This is especially true with respect to artifacts comprising many parts, multiple organizational levels, and mechanical components, such as fire drills, small mammal traps, mechanical projectiles, and winter clothing found among hunter-gatherers of the subarctic and Arctic. Comparative analysis of artifacts in these categories, where the design details are available, exhibit countless variations in materials, size, and shape of components and functions of moving parts. For example, a comparison of fire drill design among 4 native Alaskan groups, some of whom are closely related, reveals variations large and small in every single component, as well as differences in raw materials. It shows that among hunter-gatherers, as among modern industrial societies, there are many possible satisfactory artifact design solutions to a specific problem, and it provides a hint of the very large number of potential alternatives confronting their designers. My conclusion that the complexity of modern human technology in northern Eurasia before 30,000 years ago represents a quantum jump over that of their Neanderthal Denisovan predecessors is based on application of measures of computational complexity to the process of artifact design within the framework of formal design theory. We cannot know the full range of alternative design alternatives for any specific artifact explored by modern humans 30,000 years ago, or that of their Neanderthal Denisovan predecessors, or that of recent hunter-gatherers. Little enough is known about the range of design alternatives considered by engineers in historic or even modern industrial societies. Formal design theory informs us, however, that there's a mathematical relationship between A, the number of components and organizational levels of an artifact that represents a satisfactory solution to an engineering problem, and B, the size of the search space or the range of design alternatives that must be rejected to find the solution space of a satisfactory design. The exponential increase in component numbers, production steps, and organizational levels observed in the technology of modern humans in northern Eurasia before 30,000 years ago indicates a very large increase in the computational complexity of the design process that underlies this technology as reconstructed from the archaeological record. Their technology also includes examples of mechanical instruments and devices, including untended facilities that represent simple machines or automata. I am unable to find a fundamental distinction between the design of mechanical and non-mechanical artifacts in the modern engineering literature. It is clear, however, that the introduction of moving parts to the range of possible design alternatives expands the size of the search space by yet another order of magnitude. It also requires an analysis of cause and effect relationships among the moving parts that places an entirely new set of demands on the computations of the designer. A quantum jump in the computational complexity of the design process that underlies the artifacts of modern humans implies a corresponding increase in computational power over their Neanderthal Denisovan predecessors. Both formal design theory and computation theory indicate that the increased computational complexity of the design process among modern humans probably lies primarily in a greatly expanded memory storage capacity or space complexity. In terms of hunter-gatherer engineering, the implication is that modern humans constructed an increasingly massive knowledge base of available materials, production techniques, and basic components from which they eventually generated a large body of technology comparable to that of recent hunter-gatherers in the higher latitudes. The emergence and growth of this knowledge base is observable in the archaeological record, at least indirectly, beginning with evidence of mechanical projectile technology, freshwater fishing gear, and untended facilities for snaring, trapping small and medium game in sub-Saharan Africa before 50,000 years ago. As modern humans expand into southern Eurasia, Australia, and the Southwest Pacific, there is indirect evidence of navigable watercraft and deep-sea fishing technology. As already described, their initial spread into northern Eurasia 47,000 years ago is associated with indirect evidence of winter clothing in the form of eyed needles and rotary drills that conceivably reflect mechanical fire-making technology. Formal design theory informs us that these technologies are unlikely to have been developed without a substantial existing knowledge base and probably have a lengthy history of earlier development not presently visible in the archaeological record. The engineering knowledge base of the North Eurasians continued to grow during and after the last glacial maximum, with the development of technologies associated with a sedentary lifestyle, including semi-permanent structures, refrigerated storage, fired ceramics, and the domestication of dogs. The point of this extended digression on formal design theory and the measurement of computational complexity of the artifact design process among modern humans and their predecessors is to provide an explanatory model for a pattern that has been emerging in the archaeological record of northern Eurasia since 2000. Discoveries since 2000 have provided a growing body of evidence for modern human settlement of most, if not all, habitats and climate zones above latitude 40 degrees north, and the colder and drier regions of northern Eurasia during the last glacial maximum. 2001, Mamontova Yakuria on the Arctic Circle, possibly a small seasonal occupation dating to roughly 40,000 years ago. 2003, the Yana River sites above the Arctic Circle in Siberia, later yielding evidence of a likely winter occupation dating to 33,000 years ago. 2014, the Ust-Ishim femur in western Siberia at 57 degrees north, where the mean January temperature today is minus 15 degrees centigrade, yielding ancient DNA of the basal Eurasian lineages dating to about 45,000 years ago. 2017, Kyrgyz Cave in central Siberia at latitude 59 degrees north, dating to the second half of the last glacial maximum, or between 24,000 and 19,000 years ago. 2018, Uayadevu at 4,600 meters above mean sea level on the Tibetan Plateau and dating to before 30,000 years ago. And 2020, the Kostenki 11 Mammoth Bone House on the central plain of Eastern Europe, dating to the end of the first half of the last glacial maximum. Although most of these discoveries were reported as a surprise, they all follow a consistent pattern of evidence for modern humans in an increasingly wide spectrum of North Eurasian environmental settings, characterized by low plant and animal productivity and extreme winter temperatures. These settings include places where natural shelters and trees were absent. I suggest that more such discoveries are likely and that we should cease regarding them as surprising. They reflect the capacity of modern humans to design technologies that increase their foraging efficiency and success rate, as well as expanding their dietary breadth to small mammals, birds, and fish with a variety of instruments and facilities, including some that functioned automatically. This allowed them to occupy habitats where digestible plant foods were largely absent and large mammal resources were, by themselves, too scarce to support a human population. They also designed a suite of technologies for cold protection that allowed them to occupy climate zones where mean winter temperatures fell well below 0 degrees centigrade without natural shelters or wood fuel. In these settings, modern humans sheltered in heated artificial structures and foraged in tailored winter clothing. Where necessary, they used fresh bone for fuel. Why has it taken us so many years to recognize and understand this pattern in the archaeological record? I suggest that the delay reflects the low visibility of archaeological sites in open landscapes where natural shelters are rare or absent before the last glacial maximum. Site visibility in this time range is further reduced in remote and largely undeveloped regions such as Arctic Siberia. During the last glacial maximum, lowered biological productivity probably reduced human population numbers, yielding even lower archaeological visibility in these regions for the period between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. What are the implications of the pattern of human settlement in northern Eurasia for the settlement of Beringia in the Western Hemisphere? First, the absence of any traces of non-modern human taxa in the Americas is supported by evidence that the Neanderthals and probably the Denisovans were unable to occupy habitats where biological productivity was low and winter temperatures were significantly below 0 degrees centigrade. They probably were excluded from Beringia environments even during warm interglacial periods comparable to today. By contrast, Modern humans were able to occupy some areas of Beringia before and after the last glacial maximum, and the pattern of their settlement in northern Eurasia before and during the last glacial maximum suggests that the absence of their sites in other times and places is more likely due to low archaeological visibility than an inability to cope with cold climates and scarce resources. The problem of low visibility in Beringia is exacerbated by inundation of large lowland areas in both Arctic and central Beringia at the end of the Pleistocene. Modern humans occupied the Yana-Indigirka lowland during two brief interstadials that preceded Heinrich Event 3, roughly 30,000 years ago. At the time, the area represented the southern upland margin of a vast lowland plain created by exposure of the East Siberian Arctic shelf. Extreme cryo-arid climates on this plain before and during the last glacial maximum supported a steppe tundra biome populated by mammoth, bison, horse, and other large mammals. Neither cold climate or scarce resources prevented settlement of this environment, and the analysis of ancient DNA from two adult males from the Yana River sites indicates a robust hunter-gatherer population with an estimated effective size of 500. Paleogenomics indicate that while the Yana River people contributed as much as 30 or 40% of the Native American genome, they were not the principal ancestors of the latter. The indigenous peoples of mid-latitude North America and South America are primarily descended from the East Asian lineage, represented at Tenuanke 40,000 years ago. The former carry a suite of genetic adaptations to the Arctic, however, suggesting that their immediate ancestors lived in the Arctic before the divergence of the North and South American population from its parent source, which is estimated to have taken place during the last glacial maximum. This suggests, in turn, that the ancestral Native American population occupied the exposed East Siberian Arctic shelf and adjoining lowlands before the end of the last glacial maximum, because other areas of the Arctic were glaciated at the time. The other major exposed shelf area in Beringia was the Bering-Chukchi platform, which often is equated with the Bering land bridge. Climates in the southern portion of the land bridge were warmer and wetter than those of Arctic Beringia, due to the oceanic influence of the North Pacific. Human carrying capacity was undoubtedly lower, however, because the less productive tundra soils could not have supported the relatively high mammalian biomass of the Arctic zone. We can deduce that the southern coast was occupied no later than 15,000 years ago, and probably somewhat earlier, from the dating of the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, which does not appear to have opened until after 14,000 years ago. Because the initial dispersal of first peoples in mid-latitude North America precedes the availability of an interior route from Beringia by at least a few centuries, it is apparent that they are derived from a population on the northwest Pacific coast, which was accessible from Beringia only via the southern coast of the land bridge at the time. Conceivably, scarce resources on the latter discouraged human occupation during the last glacial maximum and even later. Although, given the emerging pattern of modern human settlement in northern Eurasia, this seems increasingly unlikely. Regardless of the timing of the occupation of the Bering land bridge, I conclude that the distribution of North American ice sheets in space and time was the variable that controlled human access to the Western Hemisphere, not the environments of Beringia. Thank you. I'm sorry I ran over time here by a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hooker. So we have this time, so let's move on to Dr. Ben Potter. I mentioned that tomorrow we have the round table discussion, but today also have the open discussion up to 5. So if you have any question on the discussion, we will have another open discussion. So Potter, Dr. Potter, please start.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So while there remains much debate about the peopling of far Northeast Asia and the Americas, I do believe that the genetic and archaeological data are converging in many ways. These allow for multiple models, and I stress multiple. I fully acknowledge this, but today I'm going to outline one plausible model addressing several of the issues I noted in the introduction. I stress this is a provisional model, subject to change, but I want to highlight the data I use to construct it and support it. Most of my research has been in Eastern Beringia, focused on developing models of mobility, technology, and economy, and and I'll come at this from a Beringian perspective for several reasons. First, we all agree that the earliest Americans expanded through Beringia while en route to the Americas south of the ice sheets. Second, this region arguably contains the densest concentration of ice age sites in the Americas, allowing us unprecedented control on sampling variation, seasonality, and the like. Three, by examining Beringian lifeways, we can gain insights on pre-adaptive baggage and configuration of Paleo-Indian ancestors. And finally, both hypothetical migration routes are in the area, and we can examine them in detail. Coastal sites further south don't directly bear on this, as interior populations could easily expand to the coast south of the ice sheets. So in this talk, I'll develop a model for the peopling of Northeast Asia, Beringia, and the Americas using both genetic and archaeological patterns. This should be seen as a working hypothesis. Some models geneticists work with tend to be untethered to anthropological theories of forager ecology, habitat use, and climate change. And I'll present research on interior Alaska that bear on these topics, including data on technology, economic strategies, and land use patterns, and paleo-diet reconstructions. We've long had a record of pre-Clovis sites, and recent years has seen more and more discoveries that strengthen our understanding of the first Alaskans. Both coastal routes and interior routes have empirical support, but I want to focus more critically on the broad array of Beringian data that can be brought to bear on each. In short, I think both routes were used, but by different populations at slightly different times. From the wide variety of genetic results we've talked about, the most important genetic results bearing on the timing of colonization are age estimates of lineage diversification, effective population expansion, and split times among lineages. Lamas et al. 2016 show a huge female population increase between 16 and 13,000 years ago, along with increasing mtDNA haplogroup diversity, suggesting timing for migration events. Wei et al. 2018 indicate differentiation of Y DNA lineages before 15,300 years ago in Siberia, and an upper time limit for human entry into the Americas between 15,300 and 14,300 years ago. Panati et al. 2019 also inferred male lineage expansion at the same time in a starburst pattern. Grugny et al. 2019 argue for differentiation of SNA following an interior route and NNA following a coastal route. The age estimate for SNA, that's haplogroup Q Z780, is at 14,300 years ago, and it overlaps the opening of the ice-free corridor. This was carried rapidly southward and is found in Anzac 1, the Clovis individual, and other early individuals in South America. They time the SNA expansion between 15,000 and 14,000 years ago. In contrast, NNA expanded through the northwest coast, and as glacial ice receded, they expanded eastward across Canada. Autosomal data indicate ranges for splits of basal First Americans, or FAM groups, about 20,000 years ago for ancient Beringians, and between 17,500 and 14,600 years ago for the split of NNA and SNA. The NNA and SNA split range covers a large span, but when compared to the other genetic data, the mtDNA and Y-DNA estimates, it suggests a split towards the end of that range, perhaps around 15,300 years ago. Since NNA is clearly restricted geographically to the far north, mainly Canada, and SNA is the only known clade expanding throughout the rest of the Americas, diversification within SNA is critical. A number of papers have indicated a rapid star-like radiation within SNA, consistent with a single colonization event south of the ice sheets. Sikora et al. 2018 indicate the divergence of North and South American individuals around 14,000 years ago. These are the earliest known human remains from both continents, directly dated between 12,800 and 10,000 years ago. I consider this 14,000 to 13,200 range to be the best estimate for the expansion of SNA within North America. They also found divergence of South American and Central American individuals averaging 13,800 years ago. This is Lagoa Santa separating from Miche people. I consider this range to be the best estimate for expansion of SNA within South America. The red box highlights when I think the colonization of the Americas occurred, sometime between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, but at times transgressive colonization. So with these time constraints, let's begin. So I'll use this map projection to integrate the genetic and archaeological records, emphasizing climate change and potential human responses. MIS3 was an interstadial, a warm, relatively wet period. During this, we see the emergence of a new group of people that began to split off from other East Asians, the ancestral Native Americans, or FAM. This was not a quick split, and there is evidence for a lot of gene flow between them until about 25,000 years ago. Another very different population was present in the north, termed ancient North Siberians or ancient North Eurasians, which can be linked with the Siberian Middle Upper Paleolithic, centered in southern Siberia near Lake Baikal, where the Maltaboy was found. In the warmest part of the interstadial, there was an expansion of this group to the north, found at Yana RHS. Because we don't have any evidence of admixture yet, Native Americans were still likely south of any A&E population, and so I put them there in red. In North America, Chiquihita Cave and the Hartley Mammoth date to this interval. My co-authors and I have already argued that the cave materials are geofacts, not artifacts, and the few flakes at the Hartley site have not been demonstrated to be directly associated with the dated bone. Batchelor and others have used paleofecal biomarkers to indicate a continuous 34,000-year-old record of human presence in two lakes in northern Alaska. They assume that copper stanols are a direct proxy for human presence. However, controlled studies establishing this correlation have not yet been done, and they don't consider whether this record could also be attributed to other omnivores or carnivores. A recent study with more controls could not fully distinguish canids from humans, and copper stanols had a wide overlap between the two. More reliable proxies refute Batchelor et al.'s claims of many radiocarbon dated assemblages in eastern Beringia show onset of occupation by 14,200, and more importantly, population spikes after 4,000 and after 2,000 years ago in the far north. And more recently, Ted Gable, John Hofecker, and others surveyed lake shores in that region and found no evidence of early occupations. Between 25 and 20,000 years ago, there are a number of important genetic events, but unfortunately, we have no anchor points. We have limited evidence of people in the Americas or Beringia, and across Eurasia, there appears to be a clear depopulation of the very furthest north. The reason seems clear: the onset of the MIS2 stadial, more specifically the last glacial maximum around 26 to 19,000 years ago. The regional climate was arid and frigid, and it appears that hunter-gatherers had a more difficult time. This type of environment probably caused or exacerbated increased genetic splits as people congregated in separate resource-rich areas in the south, and this would facilitate genetic isolation. This was also the period of transition from the Siberian Middle to late Upper Paleolithic. Native Americans were genetically isolated from East Asians by 24,000, marking the beginning of the Beringian standstill. They did, however, admix with ancient North Eurasians between 24 and 20, and this strongly indicates they were still in southern Siberia. If the dating holds, White Sands in modern New Mexico was occupied at this point in time. And if so, this strongly indicates an earlier peopling event, probably prior to the onset of the LGM. As to potential sources, I think the best candidate would be the ancient North Siberians represented by the Yana RHS site. And Bluefish Caves has far less convincing evidence, but I don't have enough time to talk about it here, but we can talk later. So over the latter part of the standstill period, the most recent common ancestors for all major mtDNA haplogroups are forming. All that is required genetically is that they were isolated from other East Asian populations. There is no genetic reason they should be in any one particular place. However, I don't think they were in Beringia yet. Ian Bouvet et al. Argue for a location in the Paleo-Sakhalin Hokkaido region, since there is a continuity of radiocarbon dates there and gaps in the other areas. I suspect they may have been either there or in the upper Amur or perhaps Transbaikal areas, because we probably have the emergence of the Duktai tradition somewhere in southeastern Siberia linked with early Alaskan or Beringian technology. The closest relative to FAM, as Martin talked about, is represented at the UKY individual 14,000 years ago, and that is also just south of Lake Baikal. During this period, the first Native American diversification occurred, with ancient Beringians shown as AB and other Native Americans shown as NA. Ecologically, it doesn't make sense to expand north during the LGM, but it does make sense during after 16,000 years ago when the climate was ameliorating and deglaciation well advanced. This is consistent with both mtDNA and Y-DNA genetic data, showing a major expansion and diversification in the genomes that mark the colonization of the Americas. And this tracks broadly with our archaeological data for movement to the north by populations using Juktai lithic types. I think this is a good model for entry into Eastern Beringia and the Americas, matching Wei et al.'s tighter span for dispersals. Other estimates have a larger range, so I think the dating on this could go a little earlier than 15,000. The NNA SNA group went through first, since they did continue further south, followed by the ancient Beringians. We see the first unequivocal evidence of humans in Eastern Beringia at Swan Point using Juktai technology and at Little John and the recently discovered McDonald Creek site. NNA and SNA likely split the millennia or so before Clovis. The constricted geographic corridors of the ice-free corridor and northwest coast provide excellent boundary mechanisms to disrupt gene flow and facilitate the divergence of these two groups. I suspect both routes were used by the earliest Americans, but by different populations. The interior route by at least 14,500 and the coastal route by at least 13,500, or it could be a little bit earlier. The difference is that SNA groups expanded throughout the Americas, while the NNA group appeared to remain restricted to the northwest coast into the Holocene. And this pattern fits pretty well with our first genetic anchor points. Well, it matches very well with our first genetic anchor points a few hundred years later. I should also note this is the timing of the transition from the Japanese terminal upper Paleolithic to the incipient Jomon, possibly too late to affect the initial peopling. Between 12,000 and, oh, did I miss a slide? No, I'm good. So here's our first anchor point in the Americas. The Anzac child from Montana is clearly part of Clovis, as well as clearly part of the SNA group, broadly ancestral to all Native Americans except for a few groups in the very far north. Ancient Beringians are likely associated with Chindaden points and later Denali complex types. Clovis is the first widespread manifestation, cultural manifestation south of the ice sheets, not necessarily the first people, but at least the first widespread manifestation. And we know from Moreno-Maillard 2018 that later splits within SNA sublineages date between 14,100 and 13,900 years ago, particularly for the earliest South Americans. Between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago, we have more anchor points. Genetics from Shukaka in Alaska suggest NNA groups were in the northwest coast very early and remained there until the present. Since Spirit Cave is closely related to Anzac and Kennewick has considerable SNA admixture, they provide good boundaries for the distribution about 9,000 years ago. USR shows ancient Beringians were in Alaska, associated with the widespread Denali complex. Wedge-shaped microblade cores continued to be made on the American side. In Siberia, a new culture, the Sumnagin, expanded northward at the expense of older Juktai groups. Radically different technology included conical and pencil cores and a near absence of bifacial implements. And I'm going to skip over these for time. So with these patterns in mind, I want to shift to adaptive strategies and colonization routes of the earliest Native Americans. The main question we have is, what are the ecological constraints for human adaptation and migration through both the ice-free corridor and the Pacific coast? When were the routes deglaciated and when were they ecologically viable? A clear understanding of the ecological capacities, and more importantly, the cultural practices of early Beringians found in Alaska can provide us with avenues to link environmental changes with human responses. And one of those responses is expansion into new areas. One of the richest concentrations of Ice Age sites in the Americas is found in the Middle Tanana Valley, where I've worked for the last 27 years. We have 20 components dating to the Bowling-Alarid period, and 10 of these are pre-Clovis. We have about 84 occupations that are Ice Age in time. Our team and others have investigated a number of sites with well-preserved fauna in well-stratified contexts. Economic strategies focused on bison and wapiti, or elk, and potentially earlier on mammoth. This would facilitate expansion eastward along rivers from western to eastern Beringia. Both Chindaden and Denali complexes dating to the Bowling-Alarid and Younger Dryas, respectively, had similar economies, similar prey species preferences, and land use patterns. And almost all Chindaden sites have overlying Denali occupations, so they're using the same sites. Collectively, the adaptive strategies of Siberian Juktai culture, related Swan Point, and later Chindaden and Denali complexes don't indicate a coastal origin, and no coastal or maritime-related technology appears in any of the known Beringian sites. But again, we're restricted to our known sites. Most sites are logistically organized hunting camps on bluff tops along these rivers, such as Gersel River shown here. Large game like bison and elk dominate the record along with lithic and composite weapons and processing tools. At Upward Sun River, a rare residential site, a base camp, it allows us to get a more complete picture of these early Beringians. USR dates to 11,500, but with earlier occupations that go back to 13,200 years ago. This is a rigorous reconstruction of 3 residential features and group activities. We recovered 3 burials within the central tent or house, 2 neonates and a 3-year-old child. Similar sized tents were found elsewhere at the nearby Mead site dating as early as 13,100 years ago. Our discovery of anadromous salmon and multiple components at USR pushes back the earliest use of salmon in the Americas more than 3,000 years. Salmon was available and exploited opportunistically. More broadly, of the 40 earliest components in Northwest North America, 90% are located in deep interior river valleys, and the vast majority along these broad interior river bottomlands, indicating the importance of riverine resources for these early foragers. My team has recently published the first direct comprehensive paleo-diet analyses of Paleo-Indians, in this case, the mothers of USR1 and USR2 infants, using stable isotope, amino acid, and serial analyses on teeth and bone. This part of the project was led by Karin Hoffman. We found that summer protein diet was varied, and about 40% bison and elk, 32% salmon, 22% small terrestrial game, and 6% freshwater fish. Ancient Beringians at USR did not store salmon over winter like modern Dene peoples, so salmon was situationally exploited rather than intensively harvested and stored. We have multiple sites in the Middle Tanao Valley linked to spring, summer, fall, and now winter. New strontium analyses by one of my students, Crystal Glassburn, has shown that steppe bison in this region did not migrate during colder periods, but they did change elevation seasonally. High-ranked prey would be available year-round in interior Beringia, interior eastern Beringian rivers like the Tanana and the Yukon, and people regularly hunted in uplands near glaciers. When we expand to look at earlier Beringian economies, we see an interesting trend. This graph illustrates faunal ubiquity in percent components for each time period. The earliest period is shown as blue, and the younger Dryas sites are shown in orange. Broadly, megafauna like bison, elk, moose, sheep, and caribou are similar for both periods, suggesting similar overall economies. However, the colder, more arid younger Dryas climate appears to be a stressor, and we can see a widening of diet breadth as people incorporated more small game like ground squirrel and hare. In the earliest period, we see evidence of mammoth and horse predation at Swan Point and at Mead. Fragmented mammoth postcrania, including ribs, are found directly associated with tools at Swan Point. This suggests an early focus on megafaunal grazers within herbaceous tundra, followed, after their extinction and expansion of shrub tundra, with reliance on bison and elk. Overall, we can characterize these early Beringians as high-tech foragers with an emphasis on high-ranked terrestrial megafauna. We see some seasonal use of montane areas near glacial margins. This adaptation is terrestrial and has similarities with the earliest widespread cultural manifestation south of the ice sheets, Clovis. We also have insights from the 2 earliest burials in the Americas, a Clovis child buried at Anzac, dating to 12,800 years ago, and the ancient Beringian double infant burial at USR, dating to 11,500. In both cases, large mammal hunting technology, including projectile points and organic foreshafts, were interred. This yields important insights into Paleo-Indian ideology, suggesting the importance of megafaunal hunting, even though they were incorporating other animals in their diet. So with these Beringian adaptations in mind, let's consider the evidence for the 2 proposed colonization routes along the northwest coast and through a terrestrial corridor between ice sheets. Obsidian distributions can be relevant to look at this problem. Obsidian sources are shown as black triangles. Under the coastal first hypothesis, we should see an early east-west movement of obsidian along the coast, only later movement of obsidian from the coast to intermediate basins, and then finally into the deep interior watersheds like the Middle Yukon. Coastal obsidian should appear in interior regions, and finally we should expect longer distance movement of obsidian along routes of travel or information exchange, in this case east-west along the coast. Under the interior first hypothesis, we should see early east-west movement of obsidian along the deep river and interior rivers, later intermediate basins, and then last into coastal areas. Interior obsidian should be found on the coast, and coastal use should be more patchy and perpendicular, interior coastal in orientation rather than parallel to the coast. So here are the data. Here are all the currently known sources and all known sites older than Clovis in the region. The red lines show the connections between sites and the obsidian sources. We don't see occupation of the intermediate Susitna and Copper Rivers until about 2,000 years after the earliest occupation in the Yukon, the opposite of what we would expect given the coastal hypothesis. Most of the known interior sources are found in pre-Clovis occupations, including Swan Point, dating to over 14,000 years ago. These interior sources show widespread movement east-west along river systems, averaging 200 to 600 kilometers. In contrast, there was no early use of coastal obsidian, even though sources were available and above sea level, like Sumez Island, Okmok, and Akutan. You can also note that there are no coastal sites shown during this period. Two purported early sites are Calvert Island footprints and Tricket Island. Vance Haynes, Vance Holliday, and myself have published a critique of the Calvert Island, which had purported dates of around 13,000 right at the end of this period. Our age estimates based on the stratigraphy and C14 record are between 12.7 and 12.6, which is consistent with the earliest known Northwest Coast sites like Gaudaden 1 and 2, and all of them are coming from the Younger Dryas period. At Tricket Island, a single non-cultural radiocarbon date from a test pit was used to date a few flakes in lower deposits below a much larger Middle Holocene occupation, and these lithics are associated with multiple strata, which are also dated into the early Holocene, about 11,000 years ago. The earliest known uses of coastal obsidian range between 2,000 to 5,000 years after the earliest interior obsidian use. Akutan and Okmuk are used much later in time, long after sea level stabilized in the Holocene. There is no north-south exchange of this material from the coast to the inland areas. The earliest coastal use also came from interior obsidian sources like Mount Edzaidza and those in southern British Columbia. Interior obsidian movement is widespread, averaging 450 kilometers along east-west drainages, while coastal obsidian movements are much more restricted, averaging 150 kilometers. No coastal obsidian has ever been found substantially inland. These data strongly indicate the initial corridor used by SNA peoples probably followed along the interior, followed by a later, more limited coastal expansion of northern Native Americans, or NNA peoples. In 2018, I gathered a team of archaeologists and geneticists to consider both routes, and this slide shows all pre-Clovis sites in red and later Ice Age sites in yellow. Note all pre-Clovis sites are found in the deep interior and at Clovis sites and perhaps related sites like Wally's Beach at the southern end of the corridor. Ice margins are shown in white at 14,800 years ago. This is from Dyke 2003. The new Dalton et al. 2020 ice margin, I didn't have time to put it on, but it shows an even larger corridor as they have more data to look at. Some have argued that the ice-free corridor was viable only after 13,000 or maybe 12,000 years ago, too late to be a route for Paleo-Indians. We must remember that those studies provide only minimum, not maximum age estimates. More recently, a series of geological studies have shown that ice-free corridor emerged earlier than previously thought. The black squares are geological and biological samples dated between 15,700 and 13,300 years ago, showing that ice and proglacial lakes were both gone and vegetation established by probably around 15,000 years ago. Recent work by Clark et al. 2022 suggests that the corridor wasn't open until 14,300 to 13,300, yet they used only one standard deviation. At the appropriate two standard deviations, even their own data indicate a fully opening by as early as 14.8. In any event, they are minimum ages that can't be reconciled with a wider array of OSL and IRSL dates from multiple labs indicating ice-free and proglacial lake-free conditions earlier. And you can see in the blue lines, those are the edges of the ice at those earlier periods. In sum, I argue that the terrestrial adapted populations focused on periglacial hunting of large mammal in Beringia, they would be in a perfect position to expand southward as the corridor opened up, with early successional vegetation like grasses facilitating large mammal herds like mammoth and later bison. The coalescence of the genetic data between 15,300 and 14,300 years ago, and the likelihood of perhaps a millennia-long period of low populations of Clovis ancestors, and don't think Clovis, think SNA populations, because that's what they were, suggest they took advantage of the opening corridor to expand further south. Sites like Page Latson, Wally's Beach, Deborah L. Friedkin, and perhaps Galt may reflect some of these earliest populations. What is clear is that the fluting technology was innovated south of the ice sheets, and only one subgroup migrated northward during the Younger Dryas, long after the corridor's first use. Turning to the coast, there are no known sites for the 2,000-kilometer stretch of coast between the Alexander Archipelago and the Aleutian Islands, and this lack of sites extends for the first 5,000 years after initial colonization. This is after modern coastlines stabilized near their current margins. Furthermore, technological analyses of the earliest coastal complexes in South Alaska, Ocean Bay, and Anegula indicate derivation from earlier interior traditions like Denali. We see an influx of microblade sites in Southeast Alaska along the coast during the same time, suggesting movement from the interior to the coast. The dashed red line represents an alternate route to the coast, but we know that this pass became deglaciated only around 13,000 years ago, right before we see the first unequivocal coastal sites. There are other problems for a very early coastal route. I'm on time this time. While there is evidence for deglaciation of some areas around 17,000 years ago, evidence for refugia is sporadic, particularly north of Haida Gwaii in the areas that they're going to be most critical. Besides shorefast ice, potential colonists would have to deal with seasonal sea ice that extended far south of modern distributions, as well as drift ice. This ice was present 9 months out of the year, adding to the complications of estimates of biological productivity. Hunting and navigating on pack and drift ice requires complex hunting and transportation technologies, and we see this only in the middle to late Holocene in the region. Data on the Kelp Highway appears good for California, but it's unknown in northern latitudes where this highway's existence is the most critical. When glaciers receded, the Kelp Highway may have been quite patchy. The early securely dated coastal occupations postdate the earliest interior Beringian sites by about 1,600 years, and the earliest sites for much of the coastal route only 5,000 years after the earliest interior groups. Every known cultural tradition from the Kuril Islands to the Aleutians that has evidence of maritime adaptations date to the Middle Holocene and later, and all of them have associated inland occupations that would also be observed. And so we don't see this in the early record. While sea level rise inundated many Pleistocene coastal areas, there are other areas that are isostatically uplifted, as well as salmon-rich coastal rivers and caves with pre-Clovis age fauna, and all thus far have not yielded evidence of earlier occupations. Conversely, the data indicate an interior route was available and biologically viable prior to the SNA spread and the rapid star-like radiation of SNA groups between 14,100 and 13,900 years ago. The Siberian and Beringian data demonstrate terrestrial hunter-gatherers expanded through interior river valleys during the late glacial. I'd like to close by considering some implications of these data and scenarios. First, glacial and post-glacial climate change appears to be a major driver of human population history in these regions. This history of migration, admixture, and depopulation was likely conditioned through regional environmental effects and success or failure of human adaptive strategies. Second, the emerging genetic consensus is coalescing with the archaeological records in these regions in ways that I think make sense, and we can fudge the numbers a little bit one way or another to accommodate some of these earlier sites. The models I presented offer opportunities for potential collaboration with geneticists, other archaeologists, and paleoecologists to fully integrate the patterns observed. Multiple lines of independent data work best. And while there was limited migration in the Arctic during the warm MIS-3 interstadial, there was a depopulation of northern Siberia during MIS-2, exacerbating isolation of groups into scattered refugia in southern Siberia. As climate ameliorated during deglaciation, humans using technologies facilitating high mobility and megafaunal hunting expanded into Northeast Asia and ultimately colonized the Americas. And I want to acknowledge my funding sources as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Potter. So let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Yu Hirasawa. Prepared? Okay, so please start. So hi, my name is Yu Hirasawa. First, I would like to thank the symposium organizers, Professor Shuma Honda, Ben Potter, Naoko Matsumoto, and the other scholars for giving me a chance to talk at this wonderful symposium. My talk is largely based on the idea discussed in the paper presented at the 2022 Alaska Anthropological Association meeting with Eugene Gabrit-Roux, Jan Axel Combs-Cottry, and Charles Holmes. So today I would like to talk about the specific microarray technology seen on the both sides of Beringia and adjacent regions. The theme of this symposium is out of Eurasia, or a peopling of Americas, so which occurred during the late Pleistocene. Because the theme contains the various individual phenomena that are related to the migration process, multiple and diverse studies have been conducted to solve each issue. The accumulation of these studies contributes to gaining our knowledge of migration processes. One of the most fundamental issues is migration routes and their timing. Discussion between ice-free corridor and coastal migration theory has continued for about 50 years. Biological and recent genetic studies provide population histories and their relationships. In paleontology and archaeology, defining the cause of the megafaunal extinction in the Americas has been a hot topic. Finally, revealing cultural trajectory through lithic studies such as Clovis points, Western stem points, and microarrays have taken a major role in the whole discussion of the peopling processes. So today I will mainly talk about the last topic I mentioned. So this map shows the major archaeological sites of different lithic technology in North America, and the strict Yubetsu, which I will describe later, the microarray sites in Eurasia. Although the comparative studies on microarray technology through both sides of the continents, it was limited in the northern North America because it doesn't mainly distribute in the south. On the other hand, in the southern North America, the topics of peopling of Americas are centered at the origin of Clovis or other projectile point technologies. It is unavoidable because of their distributional differences. So this talk divides the North and South America, Northern and Southern America, Southern North America, and on the focuses on the oldest microarray technology in Northern North America and its possible origin. So the starting point of my talk is a unique production technology found in interior Alaska, which is called the Ubets method. Interestingly, although about 100 years of Alaskan archaeology, this method has only been confirmed at the single site, Swan Point, the number 22 on this map. So here I would like to show the aim of this presentation. So I think considering the origin or origins of the various Alaskan microarray technology contributes to the discussion of the peopling of Americas because of three reasons. First, Alaska is a geographically significant location as one of the early migrants' destinations. Second, Alaska has a distinguished genetic group from the Paleo-Indian population found in the south. Third, the direct relationship between the Alaska microarray assemblage and the Western Beringia assemblages is not yet completely understood. So before I start talking about the lithic technology, I briefly touch on the recent ancient DNA studies in Western Eastern Beringia and Japan, because they provide interesting outcomes related to the late Pleistocene human genealogy in the regions. The existence of the ancient Beringian is revealed from the human remains from the Trail Creek Cave 2 and upward some river sites. Both individuals belong to the American Paleoarctic tradition or Denali complex in the cultural chronology. According to several genetic studies, ancient Beringian was genetically isolated population from the other Eurasian groups, such as Northern ANS, East Asian, and Jomon populations, at least from 24,000 to 95,100 BP. If the ancient Beringian was the only genetic group that migrated into Alaska in the late Pleistocene, the early sites in Alaska could be remained by the ancient Beringians. However, there are no human remains dated before 11,500 BP yet found. So we cannot deny the possibility of other populations reaching before the ancient Beringians. So this slide summarizes the technological sequence in Alaska and predicted predecessors in Western Beringia in the past studies. The earliest cultural tradition in Alaska is named East Beringian tradition by Charles Holmes. He divided the tradition into two phases. According to the latest presentation by Holmes, Potter, and Ruther, the first phase is now called the Diktai phase, based on the distinctive lithic assemblage with the Ubetz method. And the second phase is not found yet. About 1,000 years later, small teardrop and triangular-shaped bifacial points appeared that are called Chindarin points. And recently, similar points are reported in Arctic Siberia with Crow State Range as Alaska examples. Another microbraid technology for these points complex was technologically different from the East Beringian Diktai phase. Because of these circumstances, archaeologists consider this the result of the different populations moving to interior Alaska. However, recent studies see this phenomenon as a result of the remains of the different behavioral patterns left by the same population. So next, let's take a look at Western Beringia and adjacent regions. Traditionally, the original location of the microbraid appearance has been thought as southern Siberia. However, according to recent studies, microbraids with pressure fraking technique appeared around 25,000 KBP or earlier in Far East Asia, such as Hokkaido Island, Korean Peninsula, and northeastern China. Because microbraids became one of the main hunting tools in Beringia during the late Upper Paleolithic, its emergence dates and expansion routes have been intensively discussed. At the same time, to distinguish from the macrobraid technology, the definition of microbraids has been studied based on traceable features of microbraids. So the origin and definition of the technology are current primary topics of microbraid studies. Another interesting problem is the origin of the diffusion of the Ubetz method. This is the topic we focus on today. So these bifacial microcores feature long leech and ski ball have been found from both sides of Beringia. Diktai complex in Yakutia has been regarded as the origin of this technology. However, there are some criticism on the hypothesis too. As same as the area LGM microbraids, some more reliable dates of Ubetz method assemblages have been reported from different regions in Siberia and Far East Asia. As a result, there are some hypotheses that suggest the origin is in Hokkaido, northeastern China, or multiple locations. Oops, it's gone. Okay. So from here, I'd like to describe the technological features of the Ubetz assemblage at the Swan Point site. Interior Alaska is known to have main rate Pleistocene and early Holocene sites in northern North America. Especially the Swan Point site is a multi-component site that includes the oldest microbraid assemblage in North America. So to explain how the Denali complex and the East Beringian tradition are different, I showed this diagram of the microbraid production sequence. Ubetz method uses a bifacial blank and removes the entire long margin of the blank for the platform preparation. On the other hand, the campus method uses the unifacially retouched blank and the partial platform rejuvenation from the face side and lateral side is the most notable feature. So these differences are clearly identifiable from microbraid cores and other byproducts such as core tablets and ski spools. For people who are not really familiar with the stone tool technology, it seems not a big deal, but however, this technological difference is quite big because the tool makers had a totally different approach to producing the same products, the microbraids. So from here, I show the Swan Point site basic information. So this site consists of 7 cultural zones or components. 3 of the cultural zones shown on the slides have a rich number of microbraids. Culture zone 4B is at the bottom of sediments, and just above the bedrock. Artifacts excavated from there represent the Eastern Beringian tradition. Other upper cultural zones are classified as assemblages belonging to the Northern Archaic tradition based on their radiocarbon dates and artifacts. So middle holes in Culture Zone 2 and Culture Zone 1B have various microbraid core types, such as semiconical, cylindrical, tabular, and campus types. And the notch point is also an important diagnostic hunting tool for the cultural period. So since the early publications about the Swan Point Cultural Zone 4B by Charles Holmes, the microcores have been described as a different type from the Denari complex microcores. Gomez-Coutry and Holmes 2018 provided the most detailed study and report about the microcores, and they are only produced by the Yubetsu pressure flaking method. In total, 10 microbraid cores and 1 bifacial blank are found. Their platforms are created with rich and ski spore flaking along the long axis of the blank. Platform rejuvenations are also done only by the ski spore detachment. Unique features are the cortical butts on the core distal end and the dominant use of grayish-green igneous raw material. The remnant of the cortical surface seems intentional because we can observe it even on the bifacial blank too. The lithological identification of this material has been conducted, but we still don't know its specific geological classification yet. So with these technotypological features, I consider the Swan Point Culture Zone 4B microbraid cores are created by the strict Yubetsu method. So now I have to explain why I use the term strict Yubetsu rather than Yubetsu. So after Masakazu Yoshizaki suggested the Yubetsu method, late 1950s, this term spread and was used by many archaeologists working in Beringian archaeology. But because of its large regional and chronological coverage, the term applied for variations in different regions. So for 60 years by today, technotypology and chronology of microbraid cores developed through new findings and studies. So according to Sato and Tsutsumi 2007, microbraid core technotypology in Hokkaido can be classified by the criteria shown on this slide. They also differentiate the strict Yubetsu from other Yubetsu method types. So the strict Yubetsu use bifacial leaf or oval-shaped blanks. The platform is formed with long axis ridge spore detachments. The platform rejuvenation is also done by ski spore flaking. Other types are classified based on the different criteria in steps. The first important criteria are unifacial flake and blade blank or bifacial blank. This distinguishes Togeshita and other Yubetsu types. The second criterion is the length and direction of spore detachment. If the spore only removes a part of the platform, it is an Oshoroko type. The third is an orientation of spore removal against the core axis. If the spore is flaked along the short axis, it is classifiable as Lankush type. The fourth is creating keel or knot for the first spore removal. If there is no keel on the blank, the core forms a boat-like shape. So many of these technotypes are rigidly located in Hokkaido cultural sequence based on tephra chronology and radiocarbon datings. Although this classification system is based on the Hokkaido Island cases, some of these types, including the strict Yubetsu, distribute in Siberia and other Far East Asian regions. So based on this system, Swan Point Culture Zone 4B core technology is classifiable as a strict Yubetsu. So from here, I would like to compare the Swan Point strict Yubetsu method with other Western Beringian examples. Similar comprehensive work has been done by many scholars in the past. One of the most recent comparative work of the Yubetsu method is done by Zhang, 2021. He uses Ikawa Fumiko's microcore technotypology diagram and updates the regional situations. So as you see, there are various levels of technotypological classification applied in different regions for the name called Yubetsu method.
There is no doubt about variations within the UVITS method. However, the Swan.CZ4B are all strict UVITS made. Therefore, I only used assemblages with the strict UVITS and reliable radiocarbon dates for this comparative analysis. So I would like to start with the Siberian sites. As you know, Siberia has been thought of as a heartland of microgrid technology. Not only Russian and American archaeologists, but also Japanese archaeologists conducted research on it. Especially Hideaki Kimura's work is very informative because he tried to apply technotypological analysis for all major Siberian microgrid sites and reported them with high-resolution illustrations. So he used the criteria I show on the slide and classified them into 3 major techniques. For our study, we used his report and picked up the sites with techniques A and A dash, which are equal to the strict UVITS. So here is the result. The rift table shows the site list with the strict UVITS microcore. According to Kimura, the method can be seen only the east of the Angara River basin. The radiocarbon dates are cited from the date lists reported by different literature. So at first, there are not many sites that have both explicit microgrid core specimens and reliable 14C dates. However, although there are very minor variations, the strict UVITS method spreads from Lake Baikal to Far East Russia, including Sakhalin and Kamchatka. The Duktai Cave and Kura sites have the relatively older dates around 17,000 KBP, but others usually fall in the range of 16 to 14,000. Although I expect not all burins reported with illustrations, I also want to mention the existence of angular and transverse unifacial burins with the strict UVITS microcores. The second region for the comparison is the North and Northeastern China. Many Chinese scholars published revisits of the microgrid-related sites and hypotheses of their origin and sequences. Yue et al., Feng et al. Are recent finds of them. Their primary focus is defining the spatial-temporal chronology of the early microgrid industry that happened before the LGM, and the northern microgrid industry that appeared during the LGM. There are more reported 14C and OSL dates of the early industry. According to the researchers about northern microgrid industry, the strict UVITS in the region probably fits in the range from 17 to 14,000 KBP. However, I could not confirm the robust evidence of the dates which exactly indicate the timing of the strict UVITS. We need more AMS dates for the multiple UVITS assemblages in the regions. So the next region for the comparison is the PSHK, Paleo-Sakhalin Honshu Krill Peninsula. However, there is no strict UVITS site with the reliable dates on the Sakhalin and Krills. Therefore, only Hokkaido examples are discussed here. So Hokkaido Island is known to have the most divided microcore typology in Northeast Asia. In the typology, Shirataki type and Sakotsu type are included in the strict UVITS. So local scholars consider that these industries are chronologically close and partially overlap each other. However, there are not so many sites with well-associated 14C dates. The sites on the map are almost showing all of them. So I also show other UVITS methods dated as LGM sites. So I show here some examples of Sakotsu and Togeshita 2 assemblage cores on the slide. Sakotsu type is one of the strict UVITS technique, which was originally defined Yoshizaki, as I said. So Togeshita 2 is a flake or blade blank based type. Because these two types of microcores were found from the same cultural components, these types are treated as a single industry. The slide also shows the radiocarbon dates of Pirika Togeshita 1 assemblages and Sakotsu Togeshita 2 assemblages. Although the Pirika type is described often as Yubetsu in English literature, it is technologically and chronologically different. So this technology was dated during the LGM. There was a large tephra distribution, it's called NUIA, around 19,000 kbp in central and to south Hokkaido. It is also used for the separation of these different Yubets method. The radiocarbon dates from 5 sites with Sakotsu Togeshita industry show the date range from about 18,300 to 16,200 kbp. So many techno-typological studies on microwave cores have been conducted for the assemblages in Korean Peninsula too. A series of studies conducted by Song and Bae aimed to define and organize the microlithic tradition in South Korea. In addition, Gomez-Kotri critically reviewed the dates, radiocarbon dates of the microwave assemblages of the Korean Peninsula with other East Asian regions. So according to these studies, Shinbuk, Dajeong-dong, and Siangye sites are mentioned to have Yubets microcores and reliable radiocarbon dates. Shinbuk, Dajeong-dong sites have relatively older dates, but the core technology from the site is not very clear from the published literatures I could access. On the contrary, Siangye-1 site had well known to have bifacial microwave cores that fits the criteria of the Yubets method. And recently, Kim et al. Published a new excavation result at the Siangye 6 site. They reported 264 microcores were found from the cultural layer 2, and at least one explicit example can be confirmed in the paper. The date range of the layer is from about 23,000 to 19,000 kbp. This is very old compared to the other regions. The dates require to be checked from multiple perspectives in the future studies. So I'd like to summarize the results of the comparisons. In Siberia, the strict Yubets was confirmed in the different subregions. Although the Duktai cave is known as a type site of the Duktai complex, there's a contemporaneous site, Kura, on the north coast of the Lake Baikal and Upper Lena. In the north and northeastern China, northern microwave industry contains the strict Yubetsu. However, even in the recent studies, there are not enough radiocarbon dates to specify the narrow range of this assemblage. In addition, some of the studies treated Yubetsu as a very general term to indicate the bifacial blank microcores. So in Korean Peninsula, there are several LGM sites with strict Yubetsu microcores, especially Siangye sites are representative of the complex. However, I could not confirm enough number of illustrated or photographed microwave cores from the site from just the online literature review. The validity of the very old age of this lithic assemblage will also be investigated in the more detail in the future. PSHK has assemblages with good dating results, especially in Hokkaido, and it's slightly older than other areas, except for the Korean Peninsula. So I would like to conclude the presentation. In this presentation, I clearly defined the Swan Point Culture Zone 4B microcore technology as the strict Yubetsu. This must be distinguished from other Yubetsu or bifacial microcores with spore rejuvenation. Through reviews of reported strict Yubetsu assemblages and their reliable date range, I tentatively suggest that the older evidence is in Korean Peninsula and PSHK region. However, these date ranges overlap with other regions too. Therefore, at least with the current data, the strict Yubetsu diffused from somewhere in Korea and PSHK area and spread toward somewhere in Yakutia, Baikal, and northeastern China. Although I reviewed studies and tried to extract the strict Yubetsu sites in Korean Peninsula, I could not confidently identify microcores as the strict Yubetsu except the Siangye sites due to the limitation of the material on papers. So therefore, the date range of the Korean Peninsula is on this slide is given based on the Siangye sites. So even with the limitation of the site numbers, if the Siangye sites dates represent the date of the strict Yubetsu assemblage, the peninsula could be the oldest region for the microblade technology in East Asia. So this conclusion partially supports the position of Davis and Madison 2021 and Graff and Bubitz 2017 hypothesis that they explained PSHK or Far East Asia could be the LGM refugia and post-LGM migration occurred from the region. However, there is a contradiction with genome studies of the Hokkaido late Jomon people because the Jomon population diverged earlier than the ancient Beringian did from the common ancestor population and no other mixture between them. So direct migration from PSHK to Alaska is not reasonable explanation, at least now. So we need genome data and ancient Beringian of ancient Beringian or related populations in Western Beringia to solve this problem. Without this kind of direct evidence, we also can expect the technological diffusion from Far East Asia to Alaska via Yakutia. So the aim of this study was to find a possible direct origin of the Swan Point to Ubet's assemblage. Unfortunately, the result does not provide the answer because northeastern China, Baikal, and Yakutia show very similar date ranges. Therefore, it is very difficult to determine the direct starting point of the migration into interior Alaska. Under these circumstances, the direct origin can be from Ductile complex as expected by past studies or any of other similar dated regions. So to discuss the routes and timing of technological expansion, we need further studies on technological variation within the strict Ubet's method among different regions. So I thank to the people on these slides, and this is the funding information. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Still we have some minutes, 3 minutes. If you have some question about that, no? If you have one short question, is for, so Dr. Potter.
So excellent presentation. I had a question. I wonder, because the spread of microblades is so widespread, probably covering many, many we would think of as genetically distinct groups. I wonder if it's maybe the best or maybe not the best tool to track sort of these population movements, because it almost looks like diffusion of new technology because they're widespread in so many different areas at around the same time. Do you think, in terms of like the Japanese archaeologists and from what you understand of Korean archaeologists as they're thinking about this, are they linking it with specific populations or still thinking of it as just simply a technology that was widespread?
Actually, no, but I just indicated the possibility or like, so I don't expect or any specific genetic group with the Ubet's method or strict Ubet's technology, because the spreading, as you said, spreading area and then the chronological span also, many studies indicates the obsidian use of the Ubet's technique is very wide range, and also there is no evidence of the direct movement of using the obsidian itself. There could be several different kinds of the spreading reasons, like tradings or some other kind of diffusion pattern. So I don't really expect that, or I'm not assertive of any specific kinds of population stick together with that single technology. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Hirasawa. So we have a just break, 13 minutes. So we will start again at 3:30. Okay.